Power in the royal family rarely shatters loudly, it fractures in silence. But on one guarded evening, tradition cracked when Prince William crossed a line no heir is ever meant to cross. Behind closed doors, away from advisors and cameras, he confronted King Charles with words that had been building for months. This wasn't about ego or rebellion. It was about Prince George and a secret deal that could quietly redefine his future, before he's old enough to understand what's being taken from him. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The moment itself did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It arrived heavy, deliberate, and unavoidable. William had spent months weighing silence against consequence, loyalty against responsibility, and each passing day made one truth clearer: doing nothing would be a betrayal far greater than speaking out. When he finally stood before his father, the weight of centuries pressed against him, but so did something far more personal. This was no longer about hierarchy or protocol. It was about a child whose future was being shaped in rooms he would never enter, and by decisions he would never be asked to understand. The secrecy surrounding the deal was what unsettled William most. Not a casual agreement, not a passing conversation, but something constructed carefully enough to remain invisible while carrying permanent implications. It had been framed as necessary, inevitable, even protective of the institution. Yet to William it felt calculated, as though George's life had become a bargaining chip in a larger game of control, optics, and long-term stability. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, detail by detail, until denial was no longer possible. What made the confrontation inevitable was not anger, but restraint finally giving way. William had been taught his entire life to wait, to endure, to think generations ahead. But fatherhood changes the math. Suddenly the future is no longer abstract. It has a face, a voice, and a vulnerability that cannot be negotiated away. Every instinct William possessed told him that once this deal was allowed to stand unchallenged, reversing it would become nearly impossible. Silence would be interpreted as consent. Time would lock it into precedent. King Charles, for his part, was unprepared for the emotional force behind the challenge. He had expected questions eventually, perhaps frustration, maybe even disappointment. What he did not expect was the quiet resolve of a son who had already decided that obedience had limits. The exchange that followed was restrained but charged, shaped by years of unspoken tension and competing definitions of duty. Each sentence carried history. Each pause carried warning. This was not a confrontation driven by impulse. It was the culmination of months of unease, fragments of information that refused to align, and a growing fear that something precious was being reshaped without consent. William understood, even as he spoke, that nothing would be the same afterward. Lines once respected had been crossed, and authority once unquestioned had been challenged. Yet retreat was no longer an option, because once the truth surfaced, it demanded acknowledgement, and acknowledgement demanded action. But to understand why William was willing to risk everything, we have to go back to when the deal was first whispered into existence. Royal deals aren't signed in ink, they're sealed in expectation, silence, and obligation. This one never appeared in public records, never sparked headlines, and never passed through Parliament. Yet insiders claim it carried consequences that could echo for generations. Framed as a compromise, disguised as stability, the agreement quietly reshaped assumptions about Prince George's path long before anyone thought to ask whether his parents would agree. At its core, the deal was presented as foresight, not force. A long-term arrangement meant to smooth transitions and protect continuity. Phrases that sound harmless until examined closely. It was structured through informal assurances and strategic understandings, the kind that don't require signatures because they rely on tradition doing the enforcing. Nothing written, nothing declared, but everything implied. Once accepted, it would be treated as inevitable, absorbed into the machinery of the monarchy as though it had always existed. The justification rested on optics and control. The future, Charles was told, must be predictable. Markets, allies, institutions, all of them crave certainty. And certainty in this case meant shaping expectations around Prince George early, narrowing possibilities so the crown could present a seamless narrative when the time came. It wasn't described as limiting a child, it was framed as safeguarding an institution. A subtle but crucial distinction, and one that allowed difficult decisions to be rationalized as necessary rather than invasive. For King Charles, the motivations ran deeper than strategy alone. Legacy hovered over every consideration. After decades of waiting, his reign carried the pressure of proving stewardship, not disruption. Authority, once finally attained, felt fragile, dependent on demonstrating calm control rather than inherited entitlement. Advisors spoke in careful tones about lessons from the past, about mistakes made when emotions overruled structure. The deal promised order. It promised that no future crisis would catch the crown unprepared. But the benefits were uneven, and those closest to the arrangement understood it. While the monarchy gained predictability, others gained influence, relevance, reassurance. Prince George, however, gained only expectation without consent, direction without dialogue. His future became a concept to be managed rather than a life to be protected. The agreement quietly centered adult anxieties while pushing a child's autonomy far into the background. What made the deal especially volatile was who wasn't included. William's exclusion was not accidental, it was strategic. Keeping him uninformed ensured compliance through tradition rather than debate. By the time he learned of it, the assumption was that it would already be too embedded to challenge. Reversal, insiders warned, would look like instability. It would invite questions the palace had spent years avoiding. And once questions begin, control becomes impossible to guarantee. The quiet confidence surrounding the deal depended entirely on secrecy holding firm. As long as it remained unseen, it could function unquestioned. But secrecy is only powerful until it isn't. Because once knowledge reaches the wrong hands, or the right ones, the balance shifts instantly, and carefully constructed inevitability starts to look like manipulation. What King Charles didn't anticipate was how or when William would uncover the truth. The moment of discovery wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No headlines. Just a realization that landed like a blow to the chest. What William uncovered wasn't merely a plan, it was a decision already set in motion. A future mapped without his consent. A future where Prince George's role had been quietly adjusted to satisfy forces William had sworn to shield his son from. It surfaced not through confrontation, but through fragments. A conversation that ended too quickly. A document summarized but never shared. Language that felt rehearsed, polished to sound reassuring while revealing almost nothing. William had learned over the years to sense when information was being managed rather than offered. And this time the signals were unmistakable. The more questions he asked, the more carefully the answers were framed. That was when suspicion hardened into certainty. Something fundamental had already been decided, and he was expected to accept it after the fact. The betrayal cut deeper because it was layered. This was not simply about power or rank, it was about trust quietly withdrawn. William felt the familiar ache of being sidelined, a feeling he had known long before he became a father. Once again, decisions that touched his life most directly had been made around him, not with him. But this time, the stakes were unbearably higher. This time, the cost would not be measured in protocol or pride, but in the future of a child who depended on him to protect what could not yet be defended. His parental instinct collided violently with the duty he had been raised to honor. Duty demanded patience, restraint, acceptance of structures larger than the self. Fatherhood demanded resistance. William's vision for George had always been rooted in choice shaped by responsibility, not predetermined by convenience. Yet what he now understood was that Charles's priorities leaned elsewhere. Stability. Optics. A future that looked controlled rather than lived. The crown first, the child second. The realization was sobering, and it stripped away any remaining comfort William had found in silence. This was not the first time he felt history repeating itself, and that recognition frightened him more than anger ever could. He had watched the consequences of emotional distance before. He had lived inside systems that valued continuity over compassion. The thought that his son might inherit the same quiet constraints, disguised as honor, ignited something William could no longer suppress. Each passing moment made inaction feel like complicity. The internal conflict became impossible to manage. Speak, and risk destabilizing everything he had been taught to protect. Stay silent, and become the kind of figure he had once promised himself he would never be. The truth he carried began to feel heavy, almost corrosive, because once known, it demanded response. Silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice, and a dangerous one. Armed with knowledge he couldn't unlearn, William made a choice that would redefine his relationship with his father. No aides were present. No notes were taken. But those close to the palace insist this confrontation was unlike anything King Charles had faced before. William didn't raise his voice, he raised questions Charles couldn't easily dismiss. Questions about consent, about legacy, about whether protecting the crown had crossed into sacrificing a child's future. The exchange unfolded with a restraint that made it more dangerous, not less. William spoke carefully, but every word carried intent. He did not accuse, he challenged. He did not demand, he insisted on clarity. Charles, accustomed to deference even in disagreement, found himself facing a son who was no longer asking for permission to be heard. The emotional tension in the room was dense, shaped by decades of hierarchy colliding with a father's instinct to protect his own child at any cost. Charles defended the deal with the language of inevitability. He spoke of responsibility, of safeguarding the institution against uncertainty. He framed the agreement as prudent, even benevolent, insisting it was designed to prevent chaos rather than create it. From his perspective, the crown had always required sacrifice, and this was simply another example of tradition demanding difficult choices. Stability, he argued, had never been free. It had always required someone to bear the weight quietly. William refused to accept the reassurance. Vague promises and abstract justifications no longer satisfied him. He pressed for specifics, for accountability, for acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. Each time Charles leaned on tradition, William countered with consequence. Each time Charles invoked legacy, William returned to impact. The conversation became less about the deal itself and more about who had the right to make such decisions in the first place. As the exchange deepened, the balance of power shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. William was no longer simply the heir speaking to the king, he was a father confronting another father, and that dynamic stripped away the comfort of rank. Old wounds surfaced in the pauses between sentences, years of being prepared rather than consulted, shaped rather than included. The past crept into the room, bringing with it unresolved tensions that neither man could fully contain. Charles, too, was changed by the moment, though not in ways he openly acknowledged. The certainty he carried into the confrontation began to show cracks. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that authority did not guarantee loyalty, and that control could provoke resistance rather than obedience. The deal he had viewed as necessary now stood exposed as divisive, its justification no longer unquestioned, but openly challenged by the one person who mattered most. Neither man walked away unchanged. William left with the weight of having crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. Charles remained with the unsettling awareness that the future he thought he had secured was now uncertain, not because of public backlash or political pressure, but because of a private reckoning he could not undo. The silence that followed was heavier than the confrontation itself, filled with implications neither could fully escape. Yet the most dangerous part of the confrontation wasn't what was said, it was what it revealed about the monarchy's future. Prince George has always been framed as destiny in waiting. But destiny, William realized, can be shaped or constrained long before it arrives. The deal wasn't about today. It was about narrowing choices, about shaping expectations so early that resistance would one day feel impossible. And that realization haunted William more than any argument with his father ever could. What troubled him most was how subtly the future had been redirected. Nothing dramatic. No public decree. Just a quiet recalibration of assumptions that would follow George as he grew, tightening around him year by year. Certain paths would be encouraged, others quietly discouraged, until the idea of choosing differently felt almost unthinkable. The deal didn't steal George's future outright. It guided it so firmly that deviation would later be framed as risk, instability, even betrayal. William felt a familiar fear rise, one he had spent years trying to outrun. He recognized the pattern because he had lived inside it himself. Expectations set early, Roles defined before understanding could form. A public narrative that promised honor while privately demanding sacrifice. The thought that his son might inherit not just a title, but the same invisible constraints ignited a protective instinct that overpowered everything else. History, he knew, had a way of repeating itself when left unchallenged. From the outside, George's life appeared enchanted. Smiles, tradition, reassurance that the crown would one day pass seamlessly to the next generation. But William understood the distance between appearance and reality. Behind the image of destiny lay a child whose autonomy could be eroded slowly, almost politely. The deal blurred the line between guidance and control, between preparation and preemption. It suggested a future where George's role mattered more than his voice. That was where Catherine's influence became quietly decisive. She did not push, did not demand. She listened. She asked the questions that cut through rationalizations and landed on truth. What kind of man would George become if every major decision was made for him before he could weigh it himself? What would it mean to protect a son only to hand him a life already negotiated by others? Her resolve did not announce itself loudly, but it hardened William's own. Together, they understood that silence now would echo for decades. The urgency behind William's actions was not fueled by defiance, but by time slipping away. Each day that passed allowed the deal to settle further into accepted reality. Once embedded, it would become tradition, and tradition is notoriously difficult to undo. William sensed that this moment uncomfortable, destabilizing, raw might be the last window to intervene before George's future was permanently framed by decisions made without love at their core. What made it quietly heartbreaking was the knowledge that none of this would be visible to the world. No applause for intervention, no acknowledgement of the risk taken. Only the private burden of knowing that protecting George might require breaking the very patterns William had been raised to respect. Yet that burden felt lighter than the alternative standing by while his son inherited a life shaped by convenience rather than care. As tensions deepened inside the family, the consequences began rippling far beyond that private room. Royal families don't fracture loudly, they choose sides in silence. After the confrontation, subtle shifts began appearing in conversations, schedules, and allegiances. Some saw William as reckless, others saw him as the only one brave enough to say what everyone feared. And at the center of it all stood King Charles, forced to decide whether authority mattered more than trust. The divisions did not announce themselves openly. They emerged in careful pauses, in meetings rescheduled without explanation, in advisors who suddenly became harder to reach or unusually attentive. Palace corridors that once operated on predictable rhythm now felt unsettled, as though everyone was listening for cues about which direction the balance of power would tilt. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it was assessed. Every word spoken carried weight, every silence carried meaning. Some advisors gravitated instinctively toward Charles, bound by years of service, and a belief that challenging the monarch invited chaos. To them, William's actions threatened the stability they had spent careers protecting. They whispered about precedent, about the danger of heirs setting limits on royal authority. Others, however, found themselves quietly aligning with William's position, not because it was safe, but because it felt necessary. They recognized the unease growing beneath the surface of the institution, a sense that old methods no longer guaranteed future survival. The long-term implications were impossible to ignore. If William could challenge a decision this fundamental now, what would that mean once he ascended the throne? Would the monarchy become more transparent or more fractured? The confrontation had opened a door that could not be closed, revealing the tension between inherited power and earned trust. For the first time in years, succession no longer felt like a distant certainty, but an active negotiation unfolding in real time. What alarmed many within the palace was the risk of exposure. The deal had been designed to function precisely because it was unseen. Once questioned internally, the possibility of it becoming public loomed dangerously close. Advisors understood that secrecy, once cracked, invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites accountability. If the agreement were dragged into the open, it would not only raise questions about George's future, but about how many other decisions had been made quietly, without consent, under the banner of tradition. As this tension grew, isolation began tightening around Charles. Conversations grew shorter. Council became cautious. The unquestioned authority he once relied upon now felt conditional, filtered through the awareness that his own son had drawn a line he refused to retreat from. The king was no longer just managing an institution. He was managing doubt about judgment, about legacy, about whether control had been mistaken for stewardship. Beneath it all, something irreversible was taking shape. The palace was changing, not through reform announced from balconies, but through internal realignment that would shape decisions for years to come. Once people begin choosing sides, returning to neutrality becomes impossible. The monarchy had entered a phase where silence itself was a statement, and every delay signaled deeper uncertainty. But behind the strategy and silence, a deeper question loomed: could this deal even survive exposure? Every monarch believes they're protecting the crown, but history remembers the cost, not the intention. As Charles weighed the fallout, he faced a truth few kings confront willingly: that control can erode loyalty, and secrecy can corrode legacy. The deal that once felt like a safeguard now looked dangerously close to a liability. Left alone with the consequences of his choices, Charles found himself revisiting assumptions he had long treated as unshakable. He had believed that experience justified authority, that patience earned the right to decide for others, that stability demanded a firm hand even when it bruised. Yet the confrontation with William lingered, not as defiance, but as a mirror. It reflected the growing distance between command and consent, between ruling wisely and ruling tightly. The realization unsettled him more than public criticism ever could. History offered uncomfortable parallels. Monarchs before him had acted with certainty, convinced they alone could see the larger picture. Many had framed control as protection, secrecy as stewardship. And time after time, those decisions had planted the seeds of division they sought to prevent. Charles understood those lessons intellectually, yet living inside them was something else entirely. The past no longer felt distant, it felt instructive, pressing against the present with warnings he could no longer ignore. The erosion of trust between father and son weighed heavily. William's challenge was not loud, but it was final in its implications. It signaled that obedience could no longer be assumed simply because it had been customary. For Charles, this marked a painful shift. Authority that once flowed naturally now required negotiation, and negotiation demanded humility. Each interaction afterward carried strain, shaped by words left unsaid and doubts that refused to disappear. The emotional toll deepened on both sides. William carried the burden of having disrupted the order he had been raised to preserve, while Charles carried the ache of realizing that protection, when imposed, could feel indistinguishable from control. Neither man emerged victorious. Both were left grappling with loss of certainty, loss of simplicity, loss of the unspoken agreement that had once defined their relationship. Cracks began to appear in Charles's long-term vision. The future he had mapped so carefully now felt less secure, less predictable. He questioned whether the deal truly served the monarchy's survival or merely postponed reckoning. Was safeguarding the crown worth risking the loyalty of its future king? Was stability meaningful if it bred quiet resentment? These questions circled relentlessly, offering no easy answers. As pressure mounted, a decision point drew closer: maintain the course and assert authority, or reconsider and invite uncertainty. Neither option promised safety. One preserved control at the cost of trust, the other risked exposure in pursuit of renewal. The weight of the choice pressed in, heavy with consequence, because whatever came next would define not just a reign, but a legacy. And then came the moment that forced the monarchy to choose a direction forward, or back. Not all battles end with victory. Some end with lines drawn so clearly that crossing them becomes unthinkable. William didn't demand obedience, he demanded transparency. And in doing so, he changed the rules of engagement inside the royal family. Whether Charles liked it or not, the future of Prince George was no longer negotiable behind closed doors. The immediate aftermath was quieter than anyone expected, and that silence carried its own threat. There was no public reversal, no dramatic announcement, no confirmation that the deal had been dismantled. Instead, movement slowed. Conversations paused midstream. Processes once assumed to be automatic were suddenly described as under review. It was not a retreat, but it was not momentum either. The machinery of certainty hesitated. And in a system built on inevitability, hesitation itself was seismic. Within those pauses, resistance surfaced. Not overt defiance, but careful caution. Language softened. Timelines blurred. What had once been presented as settled now required further consideration. The deal, still intact on paper, began to feel less permanent in practice. Each delay chipped away at its authority, signaling that the certainty Charles had relied upon was no longer absolute. Nothing was overturned, yet nothing moved forward unchanged. William, meanwhile, shifted from challenger to guardian. He did not claim ownership over the future, he claimed responsibility for it. His stance hardened into something immovable, not a demand, but a boundary. Decisions involving George would no longer proceed without consent. The implication was unmistakable. The days of inherited silence were over. Protection would be active, not symbolic, and it would not be postponed for convenience. Catherine's role in this moment became unmistakably clear. She did not speak publicly, but her influence settled the question privately. Where doubt lingered, her clarity remained steady. Where compromise tempted retreat, her resolve anchored it. Together, she and William presented a unified front that could not be quietly divided. It was no longer one heir pushing back against a king, it was a family asserting its right to safeguard its own. For Charles, this was the reckoning he had hoped to delay. Authority still belonged to him, but it no longer moved freely. He confronted the limits of command in a way no briefing or ceremony had ever prepared him for. Power, he realized, could initiate, but it could not compel trust. The crown could insist, but it could not erase resistance rooted in conviction. The future was still his to influence, but not to dictate without consequence. What emerged was not resolution, but recalibration. The deal lingered in an uncertain state, neither enacted nor abandoned. Suspended by a standoff no one was ready to escalate further. Each side understood that pushing harder could fracture something permanently, and so the outcome remained unresolved, heavy with possibility and risk, a reminder that some conflicts do not end, they evolve. But even as the dust settled, one truth remained: the consequences of this confrontation were only beginning. The monarchy survives by adapting, or by pretending nothing has changed. But this time, something has. A future king challenged a reigning one, not for power, but for protection. And in doing so, Prince William may have reshaped what leadership inside the royal family truly means for Prince George, and for every generation that follows. What unfolded quietly between father and son marked a shift that cannot be reversed. Authority within the monarchy has long flowed downward, unquestioned and uninterrupted, reinforced by tradition and time. But this moment disrupted that pattern. It introduced a new dynamic where responsibility is no longer measured solely by rank, but by accountability. The implication is unsettling and profound. The crown may still command loyalty, but it can no longer assume silence. The long-term consequences of that shift are already taking shape. Succession, once treated as a fixed path, now appears more fluid, more contested, and more human. William's intervention signals a future where heirs are not merely prepared to inherit, but empowered to challenge. That alone alters how power will be exercised in the years ahead. It suggests that future transitions may involve dialogue rather than decree, consent rather than compliance. At the heart of it all is a quiet but decisive prioritization: protection over tradition. For generations, tradition has justified sacrifice, often framed as noble and necessary. But William's stance reframes the equation. What if preserving the institution requires first preserving the individual? What if safeguarding the crown begins with safeguarding the child destined to wear it? These questions linger, unresolved, unsettling the comfort of inherited certainty. And with those questions comes unease. If this deal existed unseen, what else has been shaped in silence? What other futures have been nudged, redirected, or constrained without consent? The confrontation did not answer these questions, it amplified them. Viewers are left to wonder how many decisions remain buried beneath layers of protocol, waiting for someone brave enough to challenge them. The emotional weight of this moment cannot be overstated. William's choice was not a rejection of the monarchy, but a redefinition of his role within it. He stood not only as heir, but as father, balancing centuries of expectation against a single undeniable instinct to protect his son. That tension will not disappear. It will follow him forward, shaping the kind of king he may one day become. Nothing about this story ends cleanly. There is no final verdict, no restored harmony, no assurance that the risks have passed. Only a sense that something fundamental has shifted, and that the future once assumed must now be negotiated. The monarchy moves forward, but under a new shadow of awareness, where silence is no longer safe, and authority is no longer absolute. Because in the royal family, the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones revealed, but the ones still waiting to surface. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.